Aconcagua is a towering, majestic mountain located in the heart of the Argentinian Andes. Standing at a height of 6,961 meters at its summit, Aconcagua, notably, is the highest summit in the world not located in Asia, and also holds the distinction of being the highest summit in the Southern Hemisphere as well. Aconcagua is also one of the 7 summits, which is something I surprisingly haven't mentioned in any of my videos yet on the channel. The 7 summits simply are the highest peaks on each of the 7 continents, and summiting all 7 of them is a commonly sought after goal for many mountaineers. In large part, because of its status as one of the 7 summits, Aconcagua is a well-known and frequently visited peak by mountaineers. The first ascent of the peak would take place in the year 1897, when an expedition team led by British climber Edward Fitzgerald would attempt to reach the summit in January of 1897. However, only one member of the expedition team, the team's Swiss guide climber, a man named Matthias Zubringen, would reach the summit successfully, reaching it on January 14th, 1897. He would complete this ascent by following a route up the northern side of the mountain, and this first ascent route would subsequently become the standard route of ascent of the peak. Notably, this standard route of ascent to the summit is considered in modern times to be an easy ascent, and in fact, it has earned Aconcagua the unique distinction of also being the highest non-technical mountain in the world, meaning that an ascent of the route does not require the use of pins, ropes, or ice axes to complete successfully. As a result, this has only served to increase Aconcagua's popularity with climbers, as it is often offered as a suggested starting point for less experienced mountaineers seeking to make forays into high-altitude mountaineering, as the overall less difficult climbing conditions somewhat offset the challenge added by the highly physically strenuous and often dangerous effects of high-altitude climbing. However, Aconcagua's reputation as an easy ascent to complete has undoubtedly also played a part in the peak's notably high mortality rate, which has earned the peak the dubious nickname of the Mountain of Death locally, and an estimated 3 climbers perish on Aconcagua's slopes annually. While no complete record of successful ascents of the peak exists, it is estimated that only 30 to 40% of summit hopefuls attempting to ascend Aconcagua actually manage to reach its summit following the standard route, as even following along this route, climbers will be forced to overcome a number of difficulties and dangers to reach the summit successfully, and unfortunately, the actual difficulty of reaching the summit is quite commonly and often tragically underestimated. In early February of 2023, the busy summertime climbing season on Aconcagua was beginning to wind to a close, as an estimated 2,500 summit hopefuls would try their hand at making a successful ascent of the peak over the course of the year's climbing season. One such climber seeking to reach the summit before the close of the summer season was a 62-year-old Norwegian man named Moy Oystein, who was attempting the ascent as part of a guided tourist expedition team. Moy and the other members of the expedition team had made good progress along their journey towards the summit, and by the evening of February 3rd, the group had reached their high camp, located at an elevation of 5,930 meters, at a site commonly referred to by climbers as Camp Berlin. In the early morning hours of the following day, February 4th, the team would set off on their push for the summit, with the group's early start allowing for ample time for the members of the team to make their way to the summit in daylight, as the final roughly 1,000 meter stretch between Camp Berlin and the summit often is referred to as the second half of the climb, as many climbers have noted that the exhausting effects of high-altitude mountaineering are significantly more noticeable at elevations above 6,000 meters. The expedition team would make solid progress throughout the morning, and by the early afternoon, the group had made their way to a concave base wall at an elevation of 6,650 meters, known as La Cueva, which is located just beneath the final and most difficult stretch of the climb, which is known as La Canaleta. As the team approached La Cueva, however, Moy Oystein would, without warning, fall unconscious and subsequently collapsed onto the ground. The expedition team's guides witnessed Moy fall unconscious and rushed to his aid, and immediately began CPR in an effort to help him regain consciousness. However, despite the guide's best efforts, Moy would not regain consciousness, and he was subsequently pronounced deceased following the cessation of their efforts. Moy's sudden and tragic death would mark the first fatality of the 2022-2023 summer climbing season. Unfortunately, however, it would not be long before Aconcagua's slopes would claim the life of another summit hopeful that very season. On January 22nd, 2023, an American expedition team would arrive at the base of Aconcagua in preparation for their upcoming bid for the summit. The team's members consisted of a 58-year-old man named John Magnus, a man named Keith Brown, and a man named Donald Fallon, who were also accompanied on their ascent by several hired local guides. All three American men were U.S. military veterans and were attempting their ascent and descent over the course of just 18 total days as part of a challenge for a fundraising campaign for the Johnny Mac Soldiers Fund, a nonprofit organization that would regularly organize such challenges as a way to encourage donations for their completion. The group's planned ascent would ideally take place over the course of just shy of 2 weeks, as they ideally sought to reach the summit by February 4th or 5th, which would allow the group 5 or 6 days to descend to accomplish the challenge climb within their 18-day window. Despite their rather rapid pace of ascent, particularly for mountaineers of their age and experience level, throughout their ascent, the team would manage to stay on pace to reach the summit within their expected time frame. On February 3rd, the Johnny Mac Soldiers Fund would post an update on the group's progress to social media that read, quote, "Team Johnny Mac is on the move again. Today, they climb 4 to 5 hours to the last camp, Cholera, from where they will attempt the summit tomorrow. Tonight, they'll have dinner at 19,586 feet. It's higher than most places on Earth. While there, the team will have an astonishing view of Mount Mercadario and other peaks of the Ramada Massif. Tomorrow's climb to the summit will take 8 to 12 hours. Climb safely today, John Magnus, Don Fallon, and Keith Brown, and get a good night's rest before summit date tomorrow. We wish you good health, strength, and safety," it read. In the early morning hours of February 4th, the Johnny Mac Soldiers Fund would again post an update to social media that read, quote, Today is Summit Day for Team Johnny Mac. U.S. Army veterans John Magnus, Don Fallon, and Keith Brown started their 18-day expedition on January 22nd, and after 10 days of climbing, the team will finally reach the summit of Mount Aconcagua. They have 8 to 12 hours of climbing today, so they'll be waking and leaving early to get the most of the long day. As a reminder, or if you're new to the challenge, Mount Aconcagua stands at 22,837 feet. It is the highest mountain in both the Western and Southern Hemispheres, the tallest peak on Earth outside of Asia, and the second of the 7 summits after Mount Everest. Man, I already covered all that in the intro. This has been an incredible challenge, and we're in awe of Team Johnny Mac's stamina and endurance. Be safe, Team Johnny Mac. We can't wait to see photos from the top, the post read. Unfortunately, however, during this final push for the summit, the team's fortunes would take a tragic turn for the worse. There are conflicting reports as to what exactly occurred during the team's fateful push for the summit on February 4th, 2023, as the guides accompanying the 3 American climbers would later state to local news outlets that 58-year-old John Magnus suddenly collapsed while the team were in the process of ascending to the summit, not far from Camp Independence, which is located at an approximate elevation of 6,300 meters. After he had collapsed, the expedition team's guides would rush to his aid and supplied him with supplemental oxygen before leading him to Camp Independence to further assist him. However, not long after arriving at Camp Independence, John's condition would only further continue to deteriorate. The guides then opted to help him descend to the Condor's Nest camp, which is located at an approximate elevation of 5,500 meters, which was better supplied and was located at a much less stressful on the body elevation than Camp Independence was. Upon their arrival at the Condor's Nest camp later on that night, over the course of the following few hours, the guides would continue their efforts to stabilize his condition. However, unfortunately, despite their best efforts, John Magnus would ultimately perish in the early morning hours of February 5th at around 2 a.m. His cause of death was stated as cardiac arrest caused by systematic exhaustion from the grueling, high-altitude climbing he had partaken in over the course of the preceding week and a half. However, in the immediate aftermath of John's death, the Johnny Mac Soldiers Fund social media accounts would suggest that another series of events had actually occurred that ultimately led to John Magnus's death. In a post made to the nonprofit's Facebook page, their account of what transpired that day ran contrary to the guides' accounts of John's death, mainly regarding whether John had reached the summit or not before his death, as the guides had previously stated that he had become stricken by his condition before reaching the summit. But this post would reveal that John had indeed reached the summit successfully before his passing, and posted this photo of John as proof, in which he is standing next to what appears to be Aconcagua's rather distinctly designed summit sign. In their admittedly less detailed account of events, the Johnny Mac Soldiers Fund social media pages would state that John had indeed reached the summit alongside his companions on the afternoon of February 4th, and subsequently would lose his life in a manner that otherwise closely mirrored the guides' accounts of the day's deadly occurrence. However, in the wake of this revelation, there was some skepticism and debate surrounding the authenticity of the photo and whether it had actually been taken at the summit of Aconcagua, as a majority of the photo's background is obscured by thick, foggy cloud cover, and while the summit sign in the picture did seem to identically resemble the sign in the photo of John, upon closer inspection, the text on the sign is just blurry enough that the actual letters on the sign aren't actually legible. The logic in this skepticism isn't warranted, as the photo of John at the summit is factually concrete evidence that John did accomplish a successful ascent of Aconcagua, and in hopes that this video will end the twin narratives that have swirled around the circumstances of John's death once and for all. In the process of making this video, I came across a summit photo taken from a very similar perspective to John's summit photograph, but it was taken on a day with crystal clear weather, and so I popped them both into my photo editing software and traced the outline of the horizon line in John's photo, one of the only discernible aspects of the background, and then repeated the process for the clear weather photo. As you can see, yeah, they're almost identical, and if you look closely enough, you can even make out this rather distinct rocky outcropping faintly in the background of John's photo. John Magnus's death would not mark the final fatality of the 2022-2023 summer climbing season, however, as tragedy on Aconcagua's slopes would occur for the third time over the span of less than a week during the upcoming few days. As the aforementioned two tragic deaths were unfolding on the upper slopes of Aconcagua, another tourist expedition team lower on its slopes would ardently continue their ascent towards the peak's summit. Amongst the climbers in this expedition team was a 41-year-old man named Anthony Simmons. Anthony was one of the team's most experienced mountaineers, aside from their guides, as he had previously successfully summited several larger peaks, including the 5,642-meter Mount Elbrus. Likely due to his previous mountaineering experience, Anthony was often amongst the leading climbers of the group and had quickly ascended from base camp to their high camp over the course of just a few short days, and on the evening of February 6th, he arrived at the team's high camp and was eager to make his push for the summit the following day. The following morning, on February 7th, Anthony awoke eager to continue his ascent towards the summit. However, his enthusiasm was not matched by the other exhausted clients of the expedition team. Furthermore, the weather conditions that morning were cold and windy with a light snowfall, which were hardly ideal conditions for making a bid for the summit. Regardless, Anthony was still very much eager to complete his ascent despite the weather, and would state his intent to attempt to reach the summit to one of the expedition team's guides. The guide would strongly advise Anthony against making his bid for the summit that day, as the weather conditions were far from ideal, and he further reasoned with Anthony that he should use the day to rest and recover at their high camp before making his bid for the summit. Anthony would summarily disregard the guide's advice, and he and this guide, who begrudgingly accompanied him, would begin their ascent towards the summit. In the early afternoon, despite the poor weather conditions, Anthony and the local guide would reach the summit in triumph. However, as the duo were in the process of making their descent from the summit, Anthony would suddenly become stricken by symptoms of acute mountain sickness, collapsing and drawing shallow, labored breaths. The guide would recognize these symptoms and would immediately provide Anthony with supplemental oxygen to assist in his breathing, and further arrange for a rendezvous with Mendoza police rescue officials at an elevation of 6,600 meters, nearby the location of the concave La Cueva landmark located at the foot of the final stretch to the summit. Due to his poor and only further declining state, the guide was essentially forced to carry or drag Anthony down the most difficult section of the climb, a slow and meticulous process that would stretch over the course of several hours. At approximately 10 p.m. that evening, the guide would be met by the police rescue team near La Cueva and loaded Anthony on a stretcher, and then would begin to descend a further 3,000 meters to a lower camp, and they would arrive at the camp at 4 a.m. the following morning on February 8th. However, by the time they arrived at the camp, Anthony showed no signs of life, and the awaiting medical staff at the camp were unable to find his pulse. His remains were subsequently airlifted to a nearby hospital, where he was officially pronounced as deceased. Thank you all for watching.